We were the wagon's only survivors. 3 sisters walked into his town barefoot that autumn. The axle came in first. Jed Farrow brought it up from the gulch on the back of his mule, dragging one end through the dirt, and he set it against the side of the smithy without saying a word about where he'd found it. I was up on the roof of the supply store nailing shingles when I heard the iron scrape the ground, and I looked down and I knew. I'd seen enough broken axles in my time, but this one had been sheared, not cracked from hard country, not worn through. Sheared. Something deliberate had gone at it, or something had hit that wagon at speed from a bad angle with a very specific intent. The wood was scorched along the upper brake. I stayed up on that roof a moment longer than I needed to. Then I climbed down. That was the morning of October the 3rd. The women came in just past noon. I want to tell you what it looked like, because it wasn't dramatic the way people make it dramatic when they tell a story like this. There was no wailing, no one collapsed in the road. 3 women walked into Cutter's crossing from the South Trail on their own 2 feet, and the thing you noticed first, the thing that stopped you, was that their feet were wrapped in strips of what had been skirts. Cloth wound up around their ankles and tied off. Their actual boots were gone. The cloth was dark at the bottom where it had soaked through, and the youngest one walked with a hitch in her left hip that she was working hard not to show. I was standing outside the supply store with my hammer still in my hand. The tallest one, she was maybe 40, dark hair pulled back, jaw set like a woman who has already decided what she thinks of this town and is prepared to be right. She looked up the main street, and she did not look scared and she did not look relieved. She looked like she was calculating. Behind her came the middle one, younger, maybe 30. She was holding the youngest girl's hand, and the youngest had red hair and was perhaps 22 or 23, and she was the one with the bad hip, but she walked anyway. The tall one saw me staring, and she said, without breaking her stride, "We need water, and we need a doctor if you have one." I said, "We have water." She said, "Then we'll start there." I have thought about that exchange many times in the years since. We'll start there. Not even a thank you, not that I needed one, just that. A woman who had come through something terrible in the last 18 hours, I didn't know how many hours yet I would find out, and she was already sequencing. Water, then doctor, then what comes next. Not collapsing, not asking for permission, working. Her name was Cora Hatch, née Branford. Her sisters were Millie and Joe. They had been traveling with their mother, a hired hand named Prout, and a man named Cobb who had been driving since independence. They were the only ones who had come out of the gulch. I found all of this out over the next few hours, not because Cora was forthcoming, but because she was practical. You needed the information to help her, so she gave it. I sat across from her at the table in the back of the store, while Millie and Joe were in the next room with Agatha Crane, who wasn't a doctor but had set more bones and sewn more cuts than anyone else in Cutter's Crossing, and didn't charge what she didn't think was fair. Cora had a cut on the back of her left forearm, long and clean, probably from a knife or a piece of metal as the wagon came apart. She had wrapped it herself with a strip from her own sleeve, and she was not going to show me that it hurt, but I could see it in the way she held the arm just slightly away from her body. She told me about the attack in plain sentences. They had been moving through the lower gulch at dusk. The hired hand Prout had gotten down from the wagon to check the lead horse's shoe, and while he was down there was a sound. She described it as a kind of hard knock against the undercarriage, and then the wagon began to pitch. It went sideways fast. She remembered getting her arms around Joe before she hit the wall of the gulch. Then there were men on horseback, 4 of them from what she could see in the bad light, and there was shooting. And then her mother was down, and Cobb was down, and Prout never got back up from checking that shoe. She said all of this the way you describe weather. Then she stopped, and she picked up the tin cup of water in front of her, and she drank from it, and she set it down very carefully on the table, and she did not speak for about 30 seconds. I did not say anything either. She said, "I need to know if those men are going to follow us here." I said they might. She looked at me, brown eyes steady. "You're not going to tell me they won't?" "No." She nodded, as though I'd confirmed something she already suspected about me, and it was acceptable. She said, "Then I need to know what you can do about it." That is the moment I could spend a long time talking about. What I can do about it. Not "please help us," not "what do we do," but "what can you do about it?" She was telling me something. She was telling me she understood that there was a difference between men who could handle a thing and men who couldn't, and that she did not intend to appeal to the second kind. She was telling me she'd already made a read on me in 20 minutes over a tin cup of water, and that she thought I was the first kind, but she needed me to confirm it. I am 68 years old now. I have had a lot of years to sit with that question. I told her what I could do. I told her about the men I trusted in that town. There were 4 of them solid, 3 more who would do all right in a pinch, and one who talked big and was not worth counting. I told her we had a defensible position in the supply store and the smithy, that the approaches from the South Trail were narrow and worked in our favor, and that I had been in a number of situations before this one that I had come out of, which I admitted was not a guarantee, but was at least a data point. She listened to the whole thing. She asked 2 questions, one about the water supply if we had to barricade ourselves for more than a day, and one about whether the men I'd counted could be trusted to hold or whether they'd break. I answered both. She said, all right. That was it, all right. She didn't thank me. She stood up, favoring that arm a little, and she said she was going to check on her sisters, and then she was going to sleep for a few hours if I could spare a place. I could spare a place. They came on the second night. I want to be honest about what the first day and a half looked like, because it wasn't all preparation and grim purpose. There were ordinary hours in there. Cora and I ate beans and hardtack at that same table while the light came through the one west-facing window and turned the dust in the air copper. And she told me about where they'd started from, a farm in Ohio that had been her husband's, and then not her husband's, and then not hers, the kind of story a lot of people were carrying west in those years. And I told her a little about how I'd ended up in Cutter's Crossing, which was a version of the story with some parts left out. She accepted the version I gave her. Joe's hip was not broken. Bruised deep at the joint, Agatha said, and she'd feel it for months, but she'd walk out of here on her own. Millie was in better shape physically, but she'd been awake both nights and wouldn't say why and you didn't push. They were both stronger than they looked, which should not have surprised me because Cora had shown me exactly what that family was made of. On the afternoon of the first day, Cora found a rifle on a shelf in the back of the store. It was a Winchester, old but kept, and she picked it up with a practiced hand, broke it open, looked down the bore, closed it, and she looked at me and said, "Can I use this?" I said yes. She said, "Show me where you want me." I put her at the upper window of the store, which had a clear line of sight on the South Trail for about 200 yards. She was steady up there. She didn't talk much. Around dusk, she came down and ate and went back up and didn't complain about it. I thought about her husband a few times, the farm that had become not hers. I didn't ask. I'd been asked plenty of things in my life that were not people's business to ask, and I tried to remember that. The men came from the south as I expected, and there were 4 of them as Cora had said, and they were not careful. That told me something. They had come after 3 women on foot in an unknown town, and they rode in at a trot on the main street at 10:30 in the evening like they were not expecting trouble. They found some. I will not reconstruct the whole of it. Gunfights are mostly confusion and a few clear moments, and a lot of things you piece together afterward. What I remember is the sound of the first shot from the upper window of the store and the way one of the rider's horses lurched left. She had hit the horse instead of the man on purpose. I found this out later. Because she did not want a dead horse falling and pinning the man, she wanted him on the ground and mobile where she could see him. That is a particular kind of thinking, the kind that people who have never been in a bad spot can't learn from a book. We had 3 of them in the dirt inside of 5 minutes. The 4th ran. Tom Hester and a man named Calloway went after him, and they brought him back at daylight. And I am not going to say what we did with him except that he was not coming back and neither were any men who might have been waiting on a report. I was standing in the street at first light when Cora came down from the store. She was still carrying the Winchester, muzzle down. She walked up to where I was standing, and she looked at the ground where things had happened, and then she looked at me. She said, "You're not hurt." I said, "No." She said, "Good," and she meant it in the way that the word means more than it sounds like. I didn't know what to do with that entirely. I am a man who is not always good at receiving a thing directly. She seemed to understand that. She just stood there next to me in the cold morning air for a while, not touching, just standing, looking at the same piece of dirt. The sky was that pale white that comes before the real light, and it was cold enough that you could see her breath. Now here is the part of the story I have turned over more times than I can count, because it was not dramatic, and that is why it got to me. They stayed. Not because they had nowhere to go, or not just because of that. Cora said there was land available east of town that she had heard about, and she asked me if the soil was any good, and I told her what I knew about it, which was a fair amount, and she listened the way she listened to everything. With full attention, no performance. About 3 weeks after they arrived, Millie got some color back. Joe stopped walking like she was trying not to show the pain and started just walking. Cora worked. She helped in the store, she fixed things that were broken. She asked about prices and kept a record that was better than the one I'd been keeping, which was essentially no record at all. She seemed to find this absurd. She said once, while she was looking at my so-called ledger, "How do you know what you're owed?" I said, "I mostly remember." She looked at me the way you'd look at a man who just told you he keeps his money in a sock. "You've been running this place how long?" 8 years. She shook her head, but she was not unkind about it. There was something in it that was almost not warmth exactly, not yet, but the beginning of warmth. A tolerance that had something in it. Like she had decided I was worth the trouble of being fixed. I was 54 years old, and I had been running that store and that town for 8 years, and I had never had anyone look at me like I was worth the trouble of being fixed. The land east of town was a quarter section, and the previous owner had started a soddy and then thought better of the whole enterprise and gone back wherever he came from. The soddy needed work. The soil was good, not Ohio good, Cora was clear-eyed about that, but adequate, and she said adequate was a word she'd made her peace with. I helped them work the soddy through November. Calloway came some days, Tom Hester came when he could, but mostly it was Cora and me working the roof while Millie and Joe worked inside. And we didn't talk a great deal because the work needed doing and neither of us was the kind to fill silence with noise. There is a thing that happens when you work alongside a person for long enough. You start to know them by how they work. She was efficient and she was not reckless and she did not pretend to know how to do a thing she didn't know how to do. She'd say, "I don't know how to do this, show me," and then she'd do it right the second time. She did not ask me to do things she could do herself. She did not make me feel in the way when I was there, which sounds like a small thing, but it is not. A man gets told he's in the way often enough and he starts to believe it. I told her once, handing up a piece of cut timber, that she was a hard woman to help. She took the timber and she said, without looking down at me, "Most men who have offered to help me were actually offering to take over." I thought about that. She said, "You're not doing that." I said I was just handing up timber. She said she knew. The first snow came in late November. Early for that country, but it came hard, about 14 inches in a night, and in the morning the whole basin was white and still, and I went out to check the horses and looked east toward that quarter section, and I thought, they'll be all right. They'd put in enough firewood, the soddy was tight now, they had enough food laid by. They'd be all right. I stood there in the snow with that thought, and then I went and checked the horses and went back inside. But I stood at that window for a while. Cora came to the store on a Thursday in early December. It wasn't a supply day. She came in and she looked at my shelves and she picked up a tin of something and set it back down, and then she turned around and looked at me. She said, "I'm not going to be one of those women who let something sit unsaid because she's afraid of the answer." I said, "All right." She said, "You've been out to that quarter section 12 times in the last 2 months." I said, "Thereabouts." She said, "That's more than the work required." I said, "The work required most of it." She said, "Not all of it." I did not have a good answer for that. She looked at me for a moment. There was something in her face that I did not know how to read, not because it was hidden, but because I was out of practice reading it. It had been a long time since a woman had looked at me as anything more than a man who could carry things or fix things or stand in front of something dangerous. She said, "I'm not easy to live alongside." I know that about myself. I've been told it more than once. I said, "I've noticed." She almost smiled, not quite. She said, "I want you to know I've noticed you too. That's all I wanted to say." Then she picked up what she'd come for, a paper of needles and a coil of cord, and she paid me what she owed and she left. I stood behind that counter for a while after the door closed. I'm not going to tell you that everything went smooth from there. Nothing goes smooth. There were arguments about the ledger, about how things should be done, about the fact that she thought I was too slow to ask for help from other men, and I thought she was too quick to assume she knew better, which she often did but not always. We are both people who learned early that you mostly have to handle things yourself, and two people like that in close quarters will knock up against each other. But here is what I will tell you. There was a night in February, deep cold, when a man came to the store sick from something, and I wasn't sure what, and I sat up with him through the night with Cora beside me, both of us taking turns with the cool cloths and the water. And around 4 in the morning, she put her hand on my arm, just rested it there, not a gesture, just placed it there, and she said in a low voice, "You're good at this." I said, "He's not better yet." She said, "I know, I meant the sitting, the staying." I looked at her then. The lamp was down low, and it was February, and the man on the cot was breathing slow, but he was breathing, and she was sitting in a straight chair wrapped in a blanket with her hand on my arm, and she was looking at me like she saw me. Specifically. Not a man who could carry things or stand in front of dangerous things. Me. I said, "I've stayed before and it didn't come to anything." She said, "It'll come to something this time." She was not talking about the sick man. He did get better. 3 days later, he was up and eating and calling it a close one. I did not think much about the credit, but I thought about what she'd said. We were married in March, when the ground was just starting to thaw. Millie stood up for her. Joe cried, which no one was surprised about. Tom, Hester, and Calloway came, and there was some whiskey that Hester had been keeping for an occasion, and this seemed like one. It was not a big ceremony. The circuit preacher came through and said the words, and we said ours, and that was that. Afterward, we walked back to the store, our store. She had made it plain by then that she considered it ours, and she was not wrong to. And she took off her coat, and she hung it on the peg next to mine, and she turned around and looked at the room the way she looked at everything, assessing. She said, "That ledger." I said, "I know." She said, "First thing tomorrow." I said, "First thing tomorrow." She looked at me, and there was something in that look. I don't know how to describe it to you except to say it was the look a person gives you when they have decided you are where they want to be. Not the look of someone who settled, not the look of someone grateful to have a roof. The look of someone who chose. I had been in that town for 8 years. I had kept it running, and I had kept its people safe, and I had done the work, and I had been largely unremarked upon, which was all right. It was what you signed up for when you ran a place like that. But unremarked is another thing from unseen, and until that year I had not been clear on the difference. She chose me, that is the plain fact of it. She walked into Cutter's crossing on wrapped feet with nothing, and she looked around, and she made her assessments, and somewhere in those months, she decided that I was where she wanted to be. It is late autumn again now, 14 years from that October. The quarter section is a real working farm now, has been for a decade. Joe married a man from 2 valleys over, and Millie stayed on to help with the children, of which there are enough to constitute a small workforce if you catch them right. The store is sound. The ledger has been sound for 14 years. I will say no more about that. I am out by the fence this morning watching the sky come up. There is frost on the grass, and the horses are making their cold morning sounds, and the light is coming in low from the east, the way it comes in October, flat and gold, and not warming anything yet. I hear the door behind me. She comes out with 2 cups, and she stands next to me, and she gives me mine, and we stand there looking at the same piece of sky without needing to say what it is we're looking at. Her hand finds my arm, the same way it found it on that cold February night 14 years ago, just rests there. The light keeps coming in. I have not always been a man who knew what he was worth. I think most men my age would say the same thing if they were being straight about it. You work and you do what the work requires, and you try not to think too hard about whether anyone is marking it down. She marked it down. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is the whole of it, right there in her hand on my arm, and the cold morning, and the 2 cups, and the frost burning off slow in the October light. The horses settle. The sky goes full.